My son Adam has always had a knack for attracting the most unusual friends. I never quite understood why, but from a young age, he always seemed to gravitate toward the kids who stood out, the ones others might consider a little different. I have countless stories about this, but one in particular has never left my mind. It lingers like a bad memory you can't shake. Back when Adam was in the 4th grade, we had just moved to a new city because of my husband's job reassignment. That meant a new house, a new neighborhood, and most importantly, a new school. Now, Adam had always been an outgoing and sociable kid, so my husband and I weren't too worried about him adjusting. If there was one thing we were sure of, it was that he could make friends anywhere. And for a while, everything seemed to be going smoothly. As a family, we were settling in well. Adam came home every day with stories about his classmates, and he seemed genuinely happy. When I finally met the other parents at a school event, I was relieved. They all appeared to be kind, respectable people. It felt like we had landed in a good place. But then, a few months after the move, I got a phone call in the middle of the day. It was the school. Something had happened involving Adam, and they needed one of his parents to come in immediately. My heart sank. My husband was at work, so it was up to me to handle it. As I drove to the school, a mix of emotions churned inside me. Frustration, because if my son had been in a fight, there would be consequences. And confusion, because that simply didn't sound like Adam. He wasn't the type to get into trouble, let alone a physical altercation. When I picked him up from class and tried to ask him what had happened, he refused to speak. That was strange. Usually, Adam was a chatterbox, an oversharer, even. The fact that he was so tight-lipped about the situation made me uneasy. Was he embarrassed? Scared? Whatever it was, I knew something was off. When we arrived at the principal's office, Adam was asked to wait outside while I went in. I took a seat across from the principal, who began with a series of standard questions. How was Adam at home? Was he respectful? Did he ever act out? I answered honestly, he was a good kid, well-behaved and kind. Then came the part that shook me. The principal explained that Adam had been involved in an altercation with another student, a boy named Christian. The details were bizarre. According to both boys, they had been the last 2 students outside after recess, walking up the stairs together, when Adam suddenly took an eraser from his pocket and struck Christian on the head. The impact knocked Christian to the ground, and he started screaming. I was stunned. That didn't sound like Adam at all. And what made it even more confusing was that I'd heard of Christian before. Adam talked about him often, always in a positive way. They were friends. The principal admitted that no teachers had actually witnessed the incident, but since both boys told the same story, there wasn't much else to go on. He assured me that Adam wasn't in any trouble, as minor playground scuffles weren't exactly rare. He just wanted to inform me about what had happened. That eased my nerves a bit, but the whole thing still didn't sit right with me. On the drive home, Adam remained silent. It wasn't until right before bedtime that he finally spoke. And when he did, what he told me made my skin crawl. He explained that the entire thing had been a setup. Christian had tricked him. They had been playing a game, a pretend fighting match, like something out of a video game. Christian had instructed Adam to pull out the eraser for a finishing move, and Adam, thinking it was all part of the game, went along with it. But the moment he did, Christian dropped to the ground, screaming like he was in agony. Then, in a low whisper, he told Adam that if he didn't go along with the story, that if he didn't admit to attacking him, there would be consequences. I was furious. My son had been manipulated, falsely accused, and made to look like the aggressor. But instead of immediately going to the school, I decided to handle it myself. That night, I went through the school directory and found Christian's mother's phone number. She answered right away. Her name was Maggie, and from the very first moment, she sounded kind. Almost overly sweet. She admitted that she already knew about the situation and had spoken to Christian, who had confessed. She assured me that she had reprimanded him and that it wouldn't happen again. I found it odd that he had told the truth so easily, but I was relieved that I didn't have to argue my case. Then Maggie said something that made my stomach turn. She explained that Christian had always struggled with behavioral quirks. That sometimes, he would act like an entirely different person. That he had a habit of losing himself in his imagination to a degree that made others uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt bad for the kid. The way Maggie spoke, it seemed like he wasn't fully in control of his actions. Then, she made a suggestion, one that, in hindsight, I wish I had never agreed to. She proposed that Adam come over for a sleepover. That maybe, by spending time together outside of school, the boys could strengthen their friendship. She even offered to host. Against my better judgment, I agreed. That weekend, I drove Adam to their house. Maggie welcomed us warmly, and while the boys played in the basement, she and I talked over a glass of wine. She seemed so normal. So genuine. Eventually, I had to ask about Christian's behavior. And that's when everything shifted. Maggie's demeanor changed instantly. Her voice dropped, and she spoke carefully, as if she was choosing her words with great caution. She admitted that Christian had been evaluated by doctors. That some professionals believed he would grow out of it. That he had been working on controlling himself, and that him being more social at school was a good sign. I should have asked more questions. But I didn't. I wanted to believe that my son was safe. That night, I left Adam there. He seemed happy. The boys were laughing, playing a board game. Everything seemed fine. The next morning, I arrived to pick him up. He was waiting at the door with his things, smiling. I assumed the night had gone well. But as soon as we drove away, Adam burst into tears. What he told me next made my blood run cold. That night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, he woke up to the sound of whispering. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was cracked open, and inside, a dim, flickering light cast strange shadows against the walls. But it wasn't a normal light, it was the glow of a candle. Then, Adam realized something chilling. Christian was in there, whispering, but not to anyone else. He was talking to his reflection. And he was calling himself by a different name. Mr. Tom. Adam was frozen in place, too afraid to move, his heart pounding as he listened to Christian talking to himself again. No, he wasn't talking to himself. He was speaking to the mirror, like he thought someone else was in there with him. Adam pulled the blanket tighter around himself, trying to ignore it, trying to pretend it wasn't happening. Then, without warning, the candle in the bathroom flickered out. The room was swallowed by darkness. Adam squeezed his eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. He didn't want to see whatever was happening. He lay there, counting his breaths, willing himself to calm down. Then the bathroom door creaked open. His stomach dropped. He wasn't alone. Whispering. Soft, eerie murmurs, right above him. Adam held his breath, terrified. The words didn't make sense. It wasn't English. It didn't even sound human. It went on, an endless stream of hushed, frantic sounds. He couldn't move. He just lay there, frozen in place, praying it would stop. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, Christian climbed back into bed like nothing had happened. By morning, he was completely normal again. Cheerful, even. Like none of it had ever happened. Adam didn't dare bring it up. When he told me about it later, I felt a chill run through me. My gut told me this wasn't just a case of childhood imagination. Something was wrong. Deeply, disturbingly wrong. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I called Maggie first. At first, she laughed it off, saying Christian had always been a creative kid. But the more I pressed, the more her voice wavered. Finally, she admitted the truth. His behavioral problems were a lot worse than she'd let on. One psychiatrist had even suggested he might have a serious dissociative disorder. They had already moved twice because of incidents at school. I was stunned. Furious. Why hadn't she told me this before? Why would she put my son in danger? Then she did something unexpected. She begged me not to tell the school. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to respect her wishes, but another part of me knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't safe. I blurted out an okay and hung up before she could say anything else. I told myself I'd decide what to do by the end of the week. But I never got the chance. That Monday, Christian snapped. During recess, he attacked another student. It was bad enough that the school sent out a vague but serious statement to the parents. By the end of the day, I found out he had been expelled. I tried calling Maggie. Her number was disconnected. She was gone. Just days ago, we had spoken, and now, nothing. No way to reach her. No other numbers. No email. Nothing in the school directory. A few days later, the curiosity became unbearable. I drove to her house, hoping for answers. The house was empty. Not just empty, abandoned. No moving trucks. No signs of a rushed departure. Just gone. It didn't make sense. How had they left so quickly? How had they erased themselves so completely? I searched for them online. Nothing. No forwarding address, no records, no social media. It was as if they had never existed at all. That was a long time ago. Adam doesn't seem to remember much about it. He wasn't too affected, or at least that's what I tell myself. Maybe he's just buried it deep down, where he doesn't have to think about it. But I remember. I remember that night. I remember the whispers. And I can't stop wondering what really happened to Christian, or what he's been doing since. I grew up in a household that was anything but typical. Raised in a Southern Baptist home, my family's beliefs weren't centered around ghosts or wandering spirits, but something far darker, demons. To us, the idea of spirits or souls didn't even exist, but the thought of evil entities was undeniable and deeply ingrained. If something unusual happened, it wasn't just some unexplained event. It was a battle between good and evil, a force beyond human understanding. As a kid, I didn't completely buy into the fear of demons, but the message was drilled into me from an early age. Denying their existence was as good as rejecting the very essence of Scripture itself. My mother, however, saw things differently. For her, faith wasn't something central to her life, it was more like an afterthought. She wasn't an atheist or agnostic, but rather indifferent. Her version of spirituality was a strange kind of understanding, something like an agreement with God that didn't require much more than that. While I found comfort and structure in religion, it was clear that my mother wanted nothing to do with it. The more I embraced it as a way to make sense of the world, the more she drifted away from it. This was one of the many things that kept us apart, especially as her struggles deepened. My mother had her battles. Addiction, mental health issues, things that she didn't want help with, and most days, she didn't even seem to acknowledge. Some days she was functional, like any other person. Other days, she was nearly unrecognizable, a shadow of herself. It wasn't easy for me, watching her unravel, but I tried not to take it personally. Looking back now, I can say with more certainty that she probably had schizophrenia, or something close to it. But in those days, mental health wasn't discussed, and treatments were rare. The understanding just wasn't there. One afternoon, something happened that I still can't explain, a nightmare that was so real I can still picture it as vividly as if it happened yesterday. In the dream, I was lying in bed when my mother burst into the room in a frenzy, screaming, her face twisted in rage. She grabbed my wrist, her grip painfully tight, shaking me violently. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But just as I was beginning to calm myself down, it happened again, but this time, I wasn't asleep. The door to my room crashed open, and there she was, exactly as she had been in my dream. Same look of anger, same uncontrollable fury, same words. It was as if the nightmare had come to life. I managed to shove her away, yelling for her to stop. And just as suddenly as it started, she left. The next morning, when I tried to confront her, she had no memory of it. She was genuinely confused, even hurt, that I was so shaken. She acted like nothing had happened, as if I had imagined the whole thing. I tried to convince myself that it was just a strange coincidence, a weird overlap between my subconscious and her emotions. But deep down, something inside me couldn't shake the feeling that it was something much darker at play. A few weeks later, something even stranger occurred. I was outside when I heard her screaming from the backyard. But it wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect, a cry for help or a shout of terror. No, this scream was different. It was almost excited. I don't know how else to describe it. I rushed outside, my heart pounding, and when I saw her, I froze. She was standing there, grinning, holding a massive snake, a creature she had been terrified of her whole life. To give you context, my mom had a deep, lifelong phobia of snakes. She couldn't even watch them on TV without flinching, let alone hold one. But there she was, gripping the snake as if it were a harmless toy. She motioned for me to come closer, holding the snake out to me. I stepped back in fear, my mind racing, and asked her, "Mom, what the hell is going on?" But she didn't seem to hear me. Her expression was vacant, her smile widening in a way that felt more like a threat than a gesture of affection. I couldn't handle it. My instinct kicked in, and I bolted back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I watched from the window as she stood there, snake in hand, smiling like she was offering it to me. Eventually, she let the snake slither away and walked back inside, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The next time I tried to bring it up, she shrugged it off, acting as if I was making up some crazy story. "You must have had a weird dream," she said, refusing to discuss it further. But that was just the beginning. That winter, my church held an overnight lock-in, a place of refuge for me where things felt more predictable, more grounded. I found comfort there, away from the chaos at home. My mom dropped me off, looking sober, and even kissed me goodnight, just as any normal parent would. However, around 4:30 a.m., as we were settling down to sleep, we heard it, a loud, rhythmic knocking coming from the chapel doors. It wasn't just the wind or an animal. The knocking circled the building, almost as if it was moving, getting louder and faster. We were all frozen in fear, unsure of what was happening. The pastor, the only one with a key, was asleep in his office, unaware of the strange sounds. I ran to wake him, and as soon as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking ceased. He opened the doors, and there she was, my mother, barefoot, hair wet with sweat, standing in the freezing cold. Her eyes locked on mine immediately, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across her face as she walked toward me. I was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. The pastor tried to hold me back, whispering for me to stay. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment, I felt completely powerless to resist. I climbed into the car with her, my mind racing with questions, but the drive home was eerily silent. When we arrived, she just stood in the doorway, staring at me, not saying a word. I hurried inside, locked myself in my room, and spent the rest of the night listening for any sounds that would indicate something was wrong. The next morning, she was back to her usual self, cooking breakfast, as if nothing had happened. When I asked her about the events of the night before, she seemed confused, telling me that she was just about to come pick me up. I felt my blood run cold. She had no memory of what happened, no recollection of showing up at the church or driving me home. What's even stranger is that no one in the church said a word about it. The pastor, the elders, nobody. It was like they didn't know how to process what had happened, or maybe they didn't want to. They just avoided the topic entirely. That's how it had always been with my mom. People just didn't know how to deal with her. She's gone now, and that period of my life is a distant memory. But the way she acted, the things she did, still linger with me. I don't know if I believe in demons or the supernatural anymore, but I can't explain what happened. Maybe it was her mental illness, maybe it was withdrawal, maybe it was something else. But the gaps in her memory, the way she sometimes seemed like a completely different person, still haunt me. I want to believe there's a logical explanation, but part of me can't help but feel like something darker was at play. When my eldest son was around 8 or 9, he started sleepwalking. I had heard stories of kids going through similar phases, so I didn't really think much of it at first. Sure, it was a bit unsettling, but I didn't consider it a big issue. I'm a pretty light sleeper, so none of my kids could ever sneak around without me noticing. That's how I first discovered my son's strange new habit. Most nights, I'd wake up to find him standing in the hallway just outside our bedroom. He'd be shifting from foot to foot, walking on his heels, like he was pacing, but his eyes were wide open, yet totally vacant. It was almost like he was staring into some unseen void, past me, beyond me, into something I couldn't comprehend. For those who've lived with a sleepwalker, you know exactly the kind of eerie emptiness I'm talking about. Sometimes he'd mumble something under his breath, too slurred to make out, and at other times, he wouldn't say a word at all. He'd just stand there, breathing deeply and steadily, in a way that somehow made it even more unsettling. I'd gently guide him back to bed, whispering his name, telling him everything was fine. But in the morning, he never remembered a thing. A few months after I had realized what was going on, things escalated. One night, I woke up to a soft, rhythmic tapping sound. At first, I assumed it was part of a dream, a noise my half-awake brain had misinterpreted. But as I lay there, the sound didn't stop. It was quiet, yet precise, each tap falling at a deliberate interval, always consistent. I couldn't figure out what it was. It didn't sound like water, and it wasn't the house creaking or settling. It wasn't the wind, either. It was too rhythmic, too intentional. I reluctantly decided to get up and investigate, not because I was scared but out of sheer curiosity. I quietly stepped out of bed, not wanting to wake my husband, who was deep in sleep. As I walked into the hallway, I saw him standing there, my son. He was facing the wall, his forehead lightly knocking against it, each tap slow and measured. His fingertips grazed the wall gently, in sync with the rhythm of his forehead taps, as though he was trying to push through it, like he was testing the wall's solidity. I called his name softly, barely above a whisper, but he didn't respond. He didn't even react, just continued to knock his head against the wall, moving like he was caught in some kind of trance. I was about to intervene when something stopped me cold. The way he moved, the eerie calmness, the sense that something was deeply wrong, it sent a chill right through me. I reached out and gently placed my hand on his shoulder, shaking him softly, trying to snap him out of it. He blinked a few times, stepped back, and suddenly seemed as if nothing had happened. I led him back to bed, and again, in the morning, he had no recollection of what had occurred. For a while, this was a rare occurrence, happening only occasionally, but eventually, it faded. I convinced myself it was just another weird sleepwalking quirk, something his subconscious mind had concocted, maybe an odd response to the physical space, something his dreaming brain didn't fully comprehend. Over time, the sleepwalking stopped completely, and the eerie staring in the hallway became little more than a weird memory, something I nearly forgot. That is, until my younger son started exhibiting the same behavior years later. At first, I shrugged it off. Kids have phases, right? Sometimes, behaviors repeat. It was just so uncanny that both of my sons had started sleepwalking at the same age. Again, no big deal. But then, I began noticing the small details, the things that made me feel uneasy. It wasn't just the sleepwalking itself, it was how he moved. The way he shifted from foot to foot in the same eerie rhythm, his eyes wide open but unfocused, his movements mimicking his older brother's, down to the tiniest detail. It was like I was watching a replay of my older son from years ago. But then, one night, it happened again. The rhythmic tapping. I could already tell what I was going to see before I stepped into the hallway. And there he was. His forehead pressed to the same spot on the wall, tapping gently, like he was trying to step into something that wasn't there. The exact same behavior as my older son had shown all those years ago. Every detail, down to the way his fingers brushed against the wall, and the way he moved. I called his name. No response. I touched his shoulder. Nothing. He just swayed slightly, completely lost in whatever trance had taken him. That's when it hit me. My younger son had never seen his older brother sleepwalking. At least, not that I knew of. He hadn't been around when his brother had done this years ago, so how could he possibly know to do the exact same thing? How could he be mimicking the same strange behavior, without ever having seen it before? I don't know why, but that thought made me feel physically ill. After some persistence, I managed to pull him out of his trance and guide him back to bed. I tucked him in and tried to tell myself it was just a phase, another odd quirk of childhood sleepwalking. And just like his brother, he eventually outgrew it. The sleepwalking stopped, the tapping stopped, and he never remembered any of it. For years, I put it out of my mind. The whole thing seemed like a strange chapter in the past, something I'd nearly forgotten about, until recently. Now, with my sons away at college, the house has been quieter than I'm used to. My husband and I decided it was time for a change, so we started renovating the house. The place is old, and we'd lived here long enough to know it needed a refresh. New floors, fresh paint, a few updates. Nothing too major, just a little makeover. As we began stripping off the old wallpaper, something strange happened. At first, I thought it was just some backing or a weird stain, but as we peeled more away, I froze. Hidden underneath was an old, antique mirror. It had been covered up for some reason. At first, I couldn't understand why anyone would bother covering up a mirror instead of just removing it. I stood there, staring at the mirror, almost waiting for something to happen. And that's when I realized something even stranger. The mirror was positioned exactly where my sons had been bumping into the wall all those years ago. The memories came rushing back, and I felt an icy knot in my stomach. There was no logical way they could have known it was there. They couldn't have possibly known about it. And yet, somehow, both of them had independently been trying to walk into something that wasn't there, something that was hidden behind the wallpaper. I had no choice but to get rid of the mirror, but the unsettling feeling hasn't left me since. I've tried to come up with a logical explanation, but honestly, I just can't make sense of it. It still haunts me. Maybe there's a rational answer to all of this. Or maybe not. But I'm not sure I want to know.